Well, can the magisterium ban the Latin Mass? One article says no. In fact, they titled the question, can the Vatican, notice they shift the term from Vatican, whereas I would suggest the question really is magisterium, but they ask, can the Vatican ban the Latin Mass? Catechism says no. We're going to explore that article, what that catechism is. But first, I want to take a look at what the magisterium says. It should be, again, more properly phrased. Can the magisterium discontinue the Latin Mass? Nearly everything in this sentence is incorrect. It's not the Vatican, it's the magisterium. It's not banning, it's discontinuing. It's not the Latin Mass, it's the Missal of 62. Notice the way people use words. They phrase things in such a way that it will yield a certain result in the minds of your average Catholic who may not be well catechized in the area of magisterial studies. So I'm going to address that problem today. Before we look at that article and consider what that catechism says about the liturgy, we need to go to the magisterium first. We need to go. Let's go, for instance, let's begin with the Council of Trent. This is an ecumenical council, arguably one of the most successful and important ecumenical councils in all history. If you've ever studied the history of our ecumenical councils, most of them turned out to be a disaster in one way or another. Not doctrinally speaking, but as far as applying them, we've had a rough time, very rough time, especially the ones in the first millennium. This one, however, was done very well, implemented very well. It was so successful, we didn't have another ecumenical council for about 300 more years until the First Vatican Council. So I think it was done very, very effectively. It was a little slow to be called and to come together in response to the Protestant Reformation, but once it got there and the ball was rolling, it did a good job. So let's take a look at session 21 of the Council of Trent and see what it says about this question. Here we go. It furthermore declares, the council that is, that this power has ever been in the church. So we're not just talking about the Vatican here, we're talking about the church, the magisterium, the papacy, and the College of Bishops, either organ. This power has been in the church, that in the dispensation of the sacraments, their substance being untouched, the church may ordain or change whatsoever it may judge most expedient. Not what I think, not what you think, not what some local bishop says, but the magisterium. And here we're talking about on the universal level, the papacy or the whole College of Bishops, not an individual cardinal, not an individual bishop, either the Pope or the College of Bishops, which is, by the way, always with and under the Pope. What it judges most expedient for the profit of those who receive, or for the veneration of the said sacraments, according to the difference of circumstances, times, and places. And it notes this is rooted in Scripture. The apostle seems not obscurely to have intimated when he says, let a man so account of us, as of the ministers of Christ and the dispensers of the mysteries of God. So this is not only something in divine revelation, originating in sacred Scripture, but it is confirmed very solemnly at an ecumenical council by the magisterium. So this would be dogmatic in nature, because a dogma is going to be a truth that has its source either explicitly or implicitly in Scripture and is confirmed by the church as such. That's what a dogma is. And so this fits the bill. This is dogmatic. Moving forward to the First Vatican Council, another ecumenical council, very important. This is around 1869, 1870. It notes in its document Pastor Eternus, it says, Wherefore we teach and declare. Notice the solemn language. This is solemn teaching. We teach and declare that by divine ordinance, this is from God. This isn't something made up later on. From God, divine ordinance. The Roman Church possesses a preeminence of ordinary power. So we're talking here about the Pope over every other church. And that this jurisdictional power of the Pope is both episcopal and immediate. He doesn't have to go through the local bishop. Both clergy and faithful of whatever rite and dignity, whether you're Latin Rite, Byzantine Rite, Armenian Rite, Coptic Rite, both singly and collectively are bound to submit to this power by the duty of hierarchical subordination and true obedience. And this not only in matters concerning faith and morals, the money quote, but also in those which regard the discipline and government of the church throughout the world. So this authority of the Pope, this authority that is dogmatically defined, is not just something pertaining to faith and morals, but also applies to disciplines in the government of the church. That would include liturgical disciplines. It also anathematizes people who say otherwise. So not only is this dogmatic in nature, and thus it's heresy to deny it, but when it's anathematized, there's an anathema for people who say otherwise. The same council, same document says, if anyone then shall say that the Pope has the office merely of inspection or direction, and not the full and supreme power of jurisdiction over the universal church, not only in things which belong to faith and morals, but also in those which relate to the discipline and government of the church spread throughout the world, or assert that he possesses merely the principal part and not all the fullness of this supreme power, or that this power which he enjoys is not ordinary and immediate, both over each and all the churches and over each and all the pastors and the faithful, let him be anathema. Pretty clear cut, right? Well, take a look at Pius XII, even more explicit than what we're seeing from Trent and Vatican I, making this dogma even more clear for our understanding, lest there be some doubt and question in our mind. From Mediator Dei, paragraph 58, it follows from this that the sovereign pontiff alone enjoys the right to recognize and establish any practice touching the worship of God. So we're talking about the liturgy here. To introduce and approve new rites, and also to modify those he judges to require modification. This is why you've had popes who have discontinued liturgical rites in the past, because he has this supreme authority. It's dogmatic in nature. If you deny it, you're a heretic. Bishops, for their part, have the right and duty carefully to watch over the exact observance of the prescriptions of the sacred canons respecting divine worship. So bishops have a duty to carry out what the sovereign pontiff, the Pope, has decided in these matters. Private individuals, even though they be clerics, may not be left to decide for themselves in these holy and venerable matters involving, as they do, the religious life of Christian society, along with the exercise of the priesthood of Jesus Christ and worship of God. Concerned as they are with the honor due to the Blessed Trinity, the Word incarnate, and his august mother, and the other saints, and with the salvation of souls as well. For the same reason, no private person has the authority to regulate external practices of this kind, which are intimately bound up with church discipline and with the order, unity, and concord of the mystical body, and frequently even with the integrity of Catholic faith itself. So in other words, no one other than the Pope can change what the Pope does here. Where does that come from? It derives from Matthew 16:18 through 19, where Jesus says to Peter, and thus to his successors, because what he establishes here contextually, based on Isaiah 22, is a office that includes succession. So what he does is he says to Peter and his successors, you are Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. Whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth is loosed in heaven. Binding and loosing includes a teaching authority, a sanctifying authority, a governing and ruling authority. That includes making modifications, introducing, approving, or modifying liturgical rites, liturgical expressions. The only qualification given here is the substance of the sacrament itself has to be preserved. So you can't change the substance of the sacrament of the Eucharist, for instance. So if you're going to say we can have Doritos and Pepsi instead of bread and wine, the Pope does not have that authority. Trent is clear about that. The popes have been clear about that. But beyond that, he has authority to modify what he sees fit, or what the entire College of Bishops collectively with and under the Pope see fit. And this would be done in an ecumenical council. Let's also look at this one. This comes from Pope Pius IX, another preconciliar source here. Everything I've given to you is preconciliar. Not that it matters, but for people that feel like somehow the preconciliar period is more valid than the postconciliar, if for the sake of those who are operating with the hermeneutic of discontinuity, I'm just proving it to you from preconciliar material. Pope Pius XII, on the suppression of a certain Armenian rite of rebellion, in an apostolic letter says this: but in order that these things may be properly accomplished, it is necessary, venerable brother, recall and inculcate in the mind of the faithful entrusted to your care that it pertains to the Catholic faith that full power and authority has been handed down by our Lord Jesus Christ to the Pope and Blessed Peter to feed, rule, and govern the universal church. This is from Jesus. The full and free exercise of which cannot be restricted. So you can't say, oh, no, I'm going to put restrictions on what the Pope is doing here liturgically. You can't do that. Provided the substance of the sacrament itself is preserved, you don't get to make that call. Only he has that authority. The full and free exercise of which cannot be restricted or checked by any territorial or national limits. And all who boast of the name Catholic must not only communicate with him as regards faith and dogmas, here's the money quote, but also submit to him as regards rites and discipline. So that's going to, of course, include liturgical discipline. That brings us to the article for the day. Can the Vatican ban the Latin Mass? Catechism says no. We're going to see all sorts of heretical statements in this. And I'm shocked by how easily so many Catholics are misled on dogmas of the Catholic Church. It makes me think that we have a lot of Catholics who are not actually Catholic, they're Protestant, and they never were Catholic to begin with. In some cases, they never shed their Protestant skin if they are converts, or if they are cradle Catholics, they've always operated with a fundamentally Protestant mentality that denies certain dogmas of papal primacy. Well, again, can the Vatican ban the Latin Mass? Notice loaded terms here. The whole thing is phrased incorrectly. It's not can the Vatican, it's can the magisterium. There's a difference because some Vatican dicasteries can operate without papal approbation. We've seen that with Ratzinger and Bertone's commentary on the Profession of Faith. Now, they're not doing so against the Holy Father or anything like that, but they don't have explicit papal approbation for some of the documents that they release. So insofar as that's the case, it's not magisterial. So there is a difference between Vatican and magisterium. So the question isn't, can the Vatican ban the Latin Mass? The question is, can the magisterium do this? And then again, it's not banning, it's discontinuing, which again, the magisterium has done in the past before. And then again, it's not the Latin Mass. The Novus Ordo can be said in Latin. And all of the components of the Roman Rite, according to Pope Benedict himself, he's going to say, hey, what you have with the Missal of 1969 promulgated then and goes into effect in 1970, what's often called the Novus Ordo, Benedict in Summorum Pontificum, in his letter to the bishops, says the Missal of 62, erroneously called the Latin Mass, is the same Roman Rite as the Novus Ordo. He says it's the same Roman Rite. And you can't put them against each other and say that one is somehow more authentic or sacred than the other. That's Benedict XVI, and he's right. He says what they are is they're two expressions of the same rite, but one Roman rite, not two, not three, not one is Roman and the other one is something else. No. One Roman rite per Benedict XVI. So it's an erroneous term. It's misnomer to call it Latin Mass. But for the sake of accommodating people, I'll use that term throughout this video. But again, I contest the use of the term. And then it says catechism says no. Well, in most minds, most Catholic minds, they're going to be thinking it's talking about the catechism of the Catholic Church, but that's not the case. They might even be thinking, well, maybe if it's not the catechism of the Catholic Church, it's the Roman catechism, the catechism of the Council of Trent. It's also not that. But my bigger question is, why are we even talking about catechisms and not magisterial documents themselves? As Ratzinger notes, all the catechism does is it functions kind of as a compendium to point you to the sources, which is scripture in the magisterial documents that it leans on, that it's deriving from. So it could be helpful to quickly to go to a catechism. Don't get me wrong. It's very useful, but you wouldn't quote the catechism as a primary source. It would be a secondary source because it's pointing you to that original document. Now, I went to the primary sources. I just took you straight to Trent. I took you to Vatican I. I took you to Pius XII Mediator Dei. I took you to Pius IX. I took you straight to the primary sources, and I read it line by line for you and offered commentary. This is something that these guys will never do. They will not interact with the primary texts. They'll put it into the realm of questions related to secondary sources, tertiary sources. They won't really go immediately to the primary sources. Now, I wonder why. I wonder why they won't interact with Trent directly. All right, be that as it may, let's go to a few points here. You're welcome to read the whole thing later, but I'll just bring out some highlights. The author of the article says, the Catechism of the Council of Trent, also known as the Roman Catechism. By the way, it's frequently excessively quoted in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, promulgated by John Paul II. The Catechism of the Council of Trent, that venerable granddaddy of conciliar catechisms, and still the most authoritative catechism in print, in its overview of the nature and limits of various obedience, similarly affirms. Let me stop there. So before we address the questions theologically that they're going to bring up, let me just address this one. The most authoritative catechism in print. Let me show you something. This isn't a secret, but here's Roman Catechism, Council of Trent. Catechism of the Council of Trent. It wasn't published by the Council of Trent. They called for a catechism. And after the council, you have Pope Pius V, who effectively puts it together and promulgates it. So it's a catechism with papal authority. The council never saw this catechism. They never saw it. It wasn't created. It's called the Catechism of the Council of Trent because they're the ones calling for it But really, it's a catechism of Pius V as far as authority is concerned, because he's the one who promulgates it. Now, guess what? Guess who promulgated the most recent catechism, the current one in use? You guessed it, the Pope. By the way, in an apostolic constitution, Fidei Depositum, an apostolic constitution, this is the highest magisterial document a Pope can issue. Apostolic constitutions is usually where you have dogmas being defined, if you're going to define a dogma, for instance. So, for example, Ineffabilis Deus or Munificentissimus Deus, dealing with the two Marian dogmas, in the last 2 centuries, apostolic constitutions. This is what was generally referred to as papal bulls, although we can make some distinctions here, historically speaking. Okay, so apostolic constitution is as high as it gets. So you said that one is more authoritative over the other, but this Pope has just as much authority as this Pope, John Paul II. They have the same amount of authority. This catechism was called for by the Council of Trent. Guess who called for this catechism? The same College of Bishops, prepared following the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council. It's the same authority backing up the two. The difference is going to be not only updates in certain theological developments that we've had in the last 500 years, but also the current catechism of the Catholic Church is much more accessible to your average person. The catechism of Pius V, however great it may be, was written for priests. It wasn't written for laity. This one right here, the current one, was written for everyone and is very accessible. You can hand this to a Protestant who is looking to convert to Catholicism, and they will be able to follow along. So it's incredibly accessible. Now, that doesn't take away from the pros that you find with the Catechism of the Council of Trent. There's some pros and cons. And the catechism that we currently use notes some of those. So it's a both and, not either or. Use both the Roman Catechism and the current one, not one against the other. And you certainly can't say one has more authority than the other, because it's literally the exact same authority promulgating both. So one is not more authoritative than another. One pope has the same amount of authority as another. And in this particular case, when they exercise their authority, they exercised it at an equal level. So that's a smaller matter. The bigger issue for me is the heresy in this. So let's tackle that. Let's go to it here. Okay, I don't know. This section here starts to talk about some catechisms. Catechism answers now. I don't know what that means. But let's scroll down to the part where he begins to promote some heresy. Okay. There is one catechism, however, that offers robust answers to both. Credo by Schneider. Now, I've done about 5 videos reviewing some very problematic aspects to Credo. So you're welcome to go and watch those. I'll put a link to them in the show notes. But this one is very disturbing. He says, it stands as the first canonically approved catechism to ever engage these questions in detail. Credo, issued under imprimatur by Bishop Schneider. By the way, an imprimatur just means let it be printed. That's all imprimatur means. And it's the authority of the bishop saying, hey, let this thing be printed, usually in their local diocese. Now, Schneider is an auxiliary bishop. He is not a full-blown ordinary. He's an auxiliary bishop. So honestly, I don't know if he actually has the authority to even promulgate that local catechism. According to canon law, canon 824, it says, unless it is established otherwise, The local ordinary whose permission or approval to publish books must be sought according to the canons of this title is the proper local ordinary of the author or the ordinary of the place where the books are published. So unless the actual ordinary bishop gave authority to Schneider to promulgate this, he doesn't have authority to promulgate it and issue an imprimatur. And again, even if he does, it just means that a local bishop has said, yeah, let it be printed, which doesn't mean a whole lot these days, given some wild stuff that has imprimaturs on them. So it doesn't really tell you a whole lot. Okay, so, and he says it's hailed around the world as a brilliant summary of faith and morals for our time. Well, depends on who you ask. I just watched a video earlier where somebody was saying John Calvin's Institutes is just hailed around the world as the greatest systematic theology book ever. And I'm just thinking, well, yeah, maybe according to you and some Calvinists, but outside of those circles, I don't think people are hailing it as the greatest systematic theology. So I would say, again, outside of certain dissenting circles, I don't think that this is very accurate. But okay, let's get to the fundamental part here. He consults the local, at best, a local catechism. Instead of, again, going to Trent, going to Vatican I, going to Mediator Dei, Pius IX, instead of going to those, we go to this random, non-authoritative catechism. Okay. Is the Pope obliged to faithfully maintain the Church's traditional liturgical rites? Yes. The early medieval papal oath affirms, I promise to keep inviolate the discipline and the liturgy of the Church as I have found them and as they were transmitted by my predecessors. And the papal oath decreed by the Council of Constance echoes, I will follow and observe in every way the right handed down of the ecclesiastical sacraments of the Catholic Church. Let me stop there. So you mean the same Council of Constance that said that it was a council that was over a pope, right? In Haec Sancta? That Council of Constance. And at this point, the dissenters are going to be saying, well, you got to understand it in an orthodox sense. Okay. All right. Cool. Or, well, some of them will say, that session wasn't approved by the Pope. Oh, so you're appealing to papal liturgy and papal authority. I'm sorry. Papal authority. Got it. What did papal authority just tell us over here, by the way, with Mediator Dei and Pius IX? Just curious. And again, the Council of Constance has to be properly interpreted and understood in light of documents like Haec Sancta, where it says that a council is over the Pope, which obviously some understandings of that would be heretical because you have this whole Vatican I that says, actually, no, the Pope is supreme in authority over and against councils, and his decisions are not subject to the permission or approval or ratification of the bishops. So, now, that being said, I don't think Haec Sancta is teaching heresy. I understand it to be teaching a version of authority of councils that highlights the authority of the council whenever it is unclear who the Pope is, which is not analogous to our situation today because we don't have any legitimately rival claimants to the throne, and Pope Francis clearly sits in that throne, and the doctrine of peaceful and universal acceptance at the time of his election establishes that he is the Pope, and so you can't pull that card either. Okay, so I just find it weird we're even talking about the Council of Constance and over and against some much more immediate, much more relevant quotes from ecumenical councils such as Trent and Vatican I. Notice they're not going to engage those things. But let me address this. First of all, the yes there is heretical. And now he's going to expand on it in a moment. So I'll expand on how heretical that is here in a moment. But the early medieval papal oaths affirm, and then note it says, discipline and liturgy of the church. That's so weird that you're pointing me to a 7th to 11th century papal oath instead of actual ecumenical councils that talk about the discipline of the church. That's so weird that you're doing that. But okay, let's go and take a look at it. Here's the thing itself. Let's take a look. Here's that profession, or that oath that they make, again, from roughly the 7th to 11th century. Let's understand it historically and in context. In the name of our Lord and God Savior, Jesus Christ, and so forth, in such indiction, such month, and such day, I, by the mercy of God, deacon, elect, and future bishop, by the grace of God of this apostolic see, swear to you, blessed Peter, Prince of the Apostles, to whom the Lord Jesus Christ, Creator and Redeemer of all, gave the keys of the kingdom of heaven to bind and loose in heaven and on earth, saying, and then whatsoever you bind on earth, bound in heaven, loose on earth, loose in heaven. Notice that, by the way, they're saying in their profession, the Pope has authority to bind and loose. And that includes over the liturgy, by the way. So it's odd you're pointing me to a profession or an oath that actually affirms the very dogma that you're undermining. And to your holy church, which today I have taken up to rule under your protection, that I shall guard with all my strength, even unto giving up the ghost or shedding my blood, the right and true faith, which, having been handed down by Christ, its author, and transmitted by your successors and disciples unto my smallness, I found in your holy church, and with your help I shall patiently bear the difficulties of the times. I shall preserve the mystery of the holy and individual Trinity, which is one God, as well as the dispensation according to the flesh of the only begotten Son of God, our Lord Jesus Christ, and the other dogmas of the God's church, just as they are deposited by the universal councils and constitutions of the apostolic pontiffs. One of those dogmas includes papal supremacy, that includes, again, full authority over the liturgy, as we saw. In the writings of the most approved doctors of the church, that is, all that concerns the brightness of your and our orthodox faith handed down by you, I too shall guard unaltered, even by a title, the holy and universal councils of Nicaea, of Constantinople, the first of Ephesus, of Chalcedon, and the second of Constantinople, which was celebrated in the time of the Prince Justinian of happy memory. An interesting reference, given that it was the same council that attempted to suspend the Pope, but that was later on scrubbed from its acts. And together with them I shall fully and entirely keep with equal honor and veneration the Holy Sixth Council, which recently assembled under Prince Constantine of happy memory, and the Apostolic Lord Agatho, my predecessor, and I shall preach whatsoever they preach, and condemn in heart and word whatsoever they condemned. Now watch this. I shall moreover diligently and heartily confirm and safeguard undiminished all the decrees of the apostolic pontiffs, my predecessors, and whatever they promulgated and confirmed in synod and individually. By the way, notice that. Notice that. He's saying, hey, whatever the popes have decreed and promulgated in synod or individually, I uphold. Didn't we just note that the Pope has plenary authority over the liturgy? So if the Pope exercises that either synodally or individually, isn't that something that this profession of this oath is noting would have to be preserved? By the way, notice that synods aren't new. And maintain them in unwavering vigor, just as my predecessors established them, and condemn with a sentence of equal authority whatever things and persons they condemned and rejected. Now here's the part that they quoted. I shall keep inviolate the discipline and ritual of the church, just as I found and received it handed down by my predecessors. And I shall preserve the church's property undiminished, and take care it is kept undiminished. Let me stop there before I read the rest and address this. Now, he's saying I have to keep inviolate the disciplines and the rituals of the church. And they're going to say, well, see, there you go. You know, Pope doesn't have an authority to modify anything liturgically in discipline or rituals that comes before him. Open and shut case, right? No, it's not an open and shut case, given that the Council of Trent explicitly says otherwise, that he has that authority, and over what he judges most expedient, not what we think. So does Vatican I, and it anathematizes anybody who says otherwise. Right here, here's the anathema. Then you have Mediator Dei, who says that the Pope has this full authority over the liturgy and discipline and worship of the church. And then Pius IX is saying it as well, among many others. It's just a snippet. So it's not an open and shut case. You can't just quote this and ignore all this other stuff. So is there a contradiction here? No, there's actually not a contradiction, because there are some disciplines that just cannot be modified. For instance, I mentioned one to you. You must use bread and wine to confect the sacrament of the Eucharist. That's going to be a liturgical discipline that can't be changed, because it does impact the validity of the sacrament and changes the substance of the sacrament. So there are some disciplines that cannot be adjusted, and some aspects to worship that cannot be adjusted. But outside of those, the Pope has full authority. Now, when it comes to the Missal of 62 to what we find with the Novus Ordo, everything that's adjusted doesn't impact, doesn't change the substance of the sacrament. It's not some kind of essential discipline that derives directly from God, or some essential part of worship that derives directly from God. The differences that you'll see between those two missals are in lesser matters. And according to these councils, he has full authority over them. So when it speaks of this, it's talking about some things that can't be modified. And clearly, it is not going to be relevant to the discussion that we're having here with these two missals and a pope's ability to discontinue a certain expression of the Roman Rite, because all of those essential aspects are still preserved in whatever missal he has promulgated currently. But not only that, let me go a step further and prove that even further to you, so that you realize this isn't speculation. If this is talking about all disciplines, is this even historically true? The popes who took this oath, they changed all sorts of disciplines in government and also in worship, adding the filioque. I mean, and again, later on, you have popes and councils who restrict communion under one kind, when administration of communion under both kinds is apostolic. So if you're going to say they have the authority to adjust that discipline, an apostolic discipline, well, wait, doesn't that violate this oath? Only if you're just reading this without any kind of critical thinking and without any kind of context, and without comparing it to anything else the magisterium has ever said. Let me give you another example. When do you think, let's talk about some of the elements of what they call the Latin Mass. What about the last gospel? When do you think the last gospel came around? 12th century is the first time we saw the last gospel introduced into the liturgy, and then on a private and local level. It wasn't brought into the Roman liturgy until the 1500s. If you look at all of the aspects to the Roman Rite, it's not first century, it's not second century, it's not third century. The Roman Rite as a rite is approximately 4th century and onward. And it took a very long time for the church in Rome to add more features, drop out some others, adjust some things. And so you have to say, okay, wait, if a lot of these, none of these elements are apostolic, aside from maybe something like praying facing east, the sacrament itself, maybe the Our Father, a few things. Aside from something that it shares pretty much in common with literally every other liturgy that we have out there, the vast majority of the things in the Roman Rite are not going to be apostolic in nature. They come later. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think that it's a wonderful liturgy, and those are things that developed over time, and I don't have a problem with them. I love them. But I'm not going to say it came down from heaven and Jesus gave it to us. No, it developed over time in many of these cases. And so the issue is the liturgical aspects that are being modified and in some cases restored with the Novus Ordo are going to pertain to things that are not necessarily apostolic in nature. They're certainly not part of the deposit of faith, part of divine revelation, because again, it didn't even exist in the first century, let alone were they saying it in Latin. And so clearly these popes did not hold to this in some kind of way that they couldn't alter anything in the liturgy, because they altered a significant amount of things liturgically and governmentally from the time of the 7th century onward, for sure. So I would just say, instead of just grabbing little snippets and putting this in a dubious catechism and then not giving any kind of context and not engaging in any kind of critical thinking, and then ignoring authoritative magisterial documents, because frankly speaking, this oath is not magisterial. Popes don't use this. This was by way of discipline anyway. So it's not even binding on anyone's conscience that they have to somehow follow this today. But okay, let's somehow say that this is relevant to our discussion. Consider it in light of more authentic expressions of the church, and that is the magisterium and what it has taught at Trent, at Vatican I, and so on. So I'll also point out this. Some of these popes at this time who are taking this oath, again, roughly 7th century. Okay. Well, take a look at this one. I did a whole video on it a few weeks ago. 7th century papal liturgy. This is the Ordo Romanus Primus, where it gives us a detailed description of what the liturgy looked like in Rome at the time. And it's not the TLM. It's not. There's a lot of differences. There's some similarities, a lot of differences, however. Oddly enough, they're communing the laity with a little tiny drop of the precious blood mixed in with a large amount of unconsecrated wine. They're using leavened bread. They're administering communion on the hand. Don't you think that there's a lot of, already you're seeing a lot of disciplines that were changed by some of these popes then? Because you find Rome then adopting other liturgical expressions and disciplines where they don't use this little tube to commune the laity with a little drop of blood mixed with a lot of wine in it, but they're administering communion in other ways and restricting it under one kind, and then not using leavened bread, they're using unleavened bread, and then they're changing things to, communion on the tongue instead of communion on the hand. And so again, if you're going to take this seriously, just think critically here. They can't just be referring to any kind of liturgical discipline, because these popes engaged in all kinds of changes to the Roman Rite liturgically. So he's talking about disciplines that would be irreformable in nature, not the kind that you have described here by Vatican I, Trent, and so on. And by the way, that's a pretty it's a pretty high standard, because there are apostolic disciplines that we have changed. Again, I mentioned to y'all, Rome restricts communion to communion under one kind for quite a while. Well, that was, again, very different than how the apostles did it. So the apostles communed everyone under both kinds. And by the way, on the hand. But the Church of Rome modified some of those practices. The apostles in Acts 15 say you can't eat meat with blood in it. The Council of Florence in the 1400s is saying, okay, well, we're going to reverse that apostolic discipline. So there are some disciplines that are even apostolic in nature that the church can adjust. So what are the disciplines that can't be adjusted? Very limited in nature. Ones that would immediately impact faith and morals and the substance of the sacrament and the constitution of the church. That's about it. So again, I just find it weird that we're quoting this in a dubious catechism without actually looking critically at the context and then ignoring what is actually authoritative. Why do you have to do this? Aren't you guys supposed to be the traditionalists? Shouldn't y'all be the ones quoting Trent? I thought I was the modernist. Again, I reject the heresy of modernism, but a lot of people slander me and say I'm a modernist. Here I am, however, actually upholding what Trent says over and against these heretics. I don't know. Make of that whatever you will. Can a pope abrogate a liturgical rite of immemorial custom in the church? No. Again, heretical from everything we just saw from Trent. Vatican I has an anathema against this. Mediator Dei, apostolic letter from Pius IX. Absolute heresy. But it says, just as the Pope can't forbid or abrogate the Apostles' Creed or Nicene Constantinople Creed, or substitute a new formula for them, neither can he abrogate traditional millennium old rites of Mass and the sacraments or forbid their use. This is pure heresy. So you just equated post-apostolic lower T liturgical traditions, and you compare them to articles of the creed, which are capital T sacred traditions that are dogmatic in nature. If you think that these elements that have been modified liturgically in the Roman Rite are somehow dogmatic and are on par with these articles of the creed, then your church, your Catholic Church, defected from the faith a long time ago, a very long time ago, because it's changed all sorts of things liturgically. And not just the Roman Church, every apostolic church has modified things liturgically. So if you're going to put them on par with somehow the articles of the creed, none of the apostolic churches have preserved the dogmas. So all of the churches have become corrupted. Ergo, Protestantism or something else is true. Maybe Mormonism, but not Catholicism, not Orthodoxy, not Eastern Orthodoxy or Oriental Orthodoxy or any of that, because they've all undergone liturgical changes. So to put on par a particular expression of the Roman Rite that took about 1,500 years to develop, elements of which didn't exist until just a few hundred years before Trent, or maybe the very century of Trent, are somehow put on par with the Apostles' Creed and the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed and the articles in it. This is heresy. He says this applies as much to Eastern as to Western rites. Again, the Pope has the exact same authority over the Roman Rite as he does over the Eastern rites and the Eastern liturgies. I know there's some Eastern Catholics that don't like to hear that, but they need to hear it because it's just as heretical to deny that as it is to say this. It's heresy either way. Could the traditional Roman Rite ever be legitimately forbidden for the entire church? Well, it's not even an issue of that, because the Roman Rite, as it constitutes a rite, is still preserved in the Novus Ordo substantially. And that's according to Benedict the 16th. So you guys don't agree with Benedict anymore? Y'all are just throwing him under the bus. So Benedict in Summorum Pontificum, y'all loved him. Y'all loved him before Traditionis Custodes. But all of a sudden now y'all are going to throw Benedict under the bus. He explicitly says it's the same Roman Rite. So we're not even talking about if somehow the Missal of 62 is discontinued. We're not even talking about discontinuing the traditional Roman Rite. The traditional Roman Rite is preserved in the current edition of the Roman Missal, according to Benedict. So again, are you guys now throwing him under the bus? I mean, I'm curious. Summorum Pontificum's no good now? That's weird. All right. Could the traditional Roman Rite ever be legitimately forbidden for the entire church? No. It rests upon divine apostolic and ancient pontifical usage. Divine. They really do believe that the Roman Rite goes back to Jesus. We saw it the other day. And we were kind of having a laugh at it. I was pulling it up on Twitter, people saying this. And I was saying this is the Catholic version of Protestants who say, some Protestants, not all, some Protestants who say, you know, the King James version of the Bible was given to us by Jesus. If it's good enough for Paul, it's good enough for me. And I have had Protestants tell me that, by the way. This is the Catholic version of that. It's not only heretical, it's hysterically, ridiculously, laughably ignorant when it comes to the development of the Roman Rite. All right. I'm going to continue here in just a moment. We're going to take a quick break. I want y'all to, before we come back, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and we will be back right after this. Hey friends, do you want others to discover why the Catholic Church is the church that Jesus established? And do you want to help people make sense of all the confusion in the Catholic Church today? Help contribute to this mission by supporting Reason and Theology at patreon.com/Reason and Theology. By doing so, you'll also get access to exclusive content for patrons only. Also, if you want to deepen your faith, there are free ebooks and even courses that you can sign up for by visiting reason.podia.com. Hey friends, are you thinking about converting to Eastern Orthodoxy? If so, I have the book just for you. It's called Answering Orthodoxy. In this book, I engage all of the objections that Eastern Orthodox have against the Catholic Church. I respond to all of them, refute them, and I show why the Catholic Church alone possesses the fullness of the faith. Get your copy today at shop.catholic.com. All right, before we continue with this heresy, I have to, reviewing their heresy, I have to comment on something I saw not long ago in the comment section that I've been meaning to address. You often hear people in this group speak about organic development of the liturgy, and they'll just point to the role of organic development, which isn't entirely helpful, given that there are plenty of elements in the Roman Rite that were not organically developed, but were introduced through papal power. Be that as it may, putting that inconsistency to the side, I just want to say the people who often point to organic development as opposed to the post-conciliar liturgy that's kind of, you know, done in a conciliar way and through committees and stuff like that, I just want to say, you know, I noticed that this particular group that usually brings up organic development would never allow for organic development today. Like, can you imagine them? So these communities that use the Missal of 62, would they allow for organic development of the liturgy on the local level? No. Not in a million years. Can you imagine some liturgy, you know, some local churches trying to introduce liturgical elements on the local level, introducing it to the Missal of 62 or the Missal of 55 or something? They would freak out. They would say, no, you can't do that. You've got to do it exactly according to the rubrics. Okay. So you want to use the organic development card up until a certain period, but up until this period, like at this point, it just has the, like, completely die, can't develop anymore organically. We're done, right? Just have to throw that one out. Anyways, let's go back to the article here. All right. It rests on divine, apostolic, and ancient pontifical usage. The Roman Rite is not in its source from the divine, neither is it apostolic in nature. It developed later on. However venerable it may be, and I love the Roman Rite, and I will defend it tooth and nail over and against Orthodox who say there's all kinds of innovations in it. And okay, in some aspects, yes, there are some innovations to it, but I'll defend the legitimacy of the church in creating those innovations liturgically. I'll fight tooth and nail against the Orthodox on those points. So I love the Roman Rite, but it didn't begin with Jesus of Nazareth 2,000 years ago, nor the apostles. So the only way we can speak about the Roman Rite being divine and apostolic is in the same way that we could speak of the Novus Ordo being divine and apostolic, and that is the substance of the sacrament that it administers during the liturgy is divine and apostolic. That's basically it. Like all this other stuff is stuff that came later. Maybe you can just say, okay, the sacrament itself is the skeleton, and yeah, that is divine and apostolic. But all this other stuff, the flesh, the skin on it, all of that came later. So this is just odd. Okay, and it bears the canonical force of immemorial custom. Canonical force, interesting. Given how much canon law has changed in 2,000 years, we didn't even have really anything official until 1917 in some regards. But okay, who is the one who promulgates canon law and who's over canon law? Oh yeah, the Pope. I remember. Yeah, the Pope. The Pope's over canon law. So you can't say, well, this canon's been around for a long time. You know what other canon has been around for a long time? Nicaea I's canon about not kneeling during Sunday. But Roman Catholics kneel during Sunday and have for a very long time. But that canon's been around for 1,700 years, and the Roman Rite has not obeyed that canon in 1,700 years. It never received that canon. Why? Because ultimately those canons are based on papal authority, right? So if the Pope didn't accept the canon, then it's not binding. So you can't speak of canonical force of immemorial custom when you have, for crying out loud, a whole canon 1,700 years old that the Roman Rite has never followed. And that's just one among numerous others. You want to know another one that has a lot of antiquity to it? Canon 101 of Trullo, promulgated by the Sixth Ecumenical Council. Never, of course, accepted by the this particular canon. Never accepted by the papacy, though many of its other canons were. But it specifically mandates communion in the hand. Well, that has immemorial force canonically to it, much more than some of the ones that they would point to. And so you don't follow that one. Why? Because the Pope didn't receive that particular canon. Oh, so these canons go back to whether or not the Pope binds and looses, right? Receives it or not. And the same Pope who receives a canon can also then change and modify and abrogate a canon. And we've had many popes who have abrogated canons. And so this is just wild stuff, wildly terrible and trashy arguments to defend a heresy. And I have to ask, I thought it was you guys who were supposed to be traditional. Why is it that, modernist Michael, and again, I'm not a modernist, but that's what these guys say about me. Why is it that modernist Lofton has to defend the Council of Trent over you guys? That's weird. I hope they're experiencing cognitive dissonance when they watch this. It can never be abrogated or forbidden. Based on whose authority? According to who? Certainly not the universal magisterium that has said otherwise. This is heresy. Must we comply with the prohibition of traditional Catholic liturgical rites? No. What earlier generations held as sacred remains sacred and great for us too. This is hilarious. They're quoting Benedict from Summorum Pontificum and the accompanying letter that Benedict gave. They're quoting Benedict. The same Benedict who says in this immediate context, I think it's literally the sentence before this, if I'm not mistaken, says that the Novus Ordo is the same Roman Rite as the Latin Mass. Now, obviously, he uses the appropriate terms and says extraordinary and ordinary form. But he says it's the one Roman Rite, and they can't be considered two rites. So you're cherry picking some things that he said, and then completely rejecting him contextually elsewhere. Benedict doesn't agree with what you're saying. He would never agree with what you're saying. So why even quote a guy who doesn't agree with what you're saying contextually? That's just weird. To me, what it reflects is a lack of awareness of the sources that they're attempting to engage. This is really, really poor theological, historical, and liturgical research is what this is. And I agree, what earlier generations held as sacred remains sacred and great for us too. Nobody is saying otherwise. So if the Missal of 62 is discontinued, it wouldn't be because it's not sacred. It would be because people are weaponizing it. That has nothing to do with what Benedict is talking about here. So it's completely irrelevant. And he says it can't all of the sudden be entirely forbidden. Well, it hasn't been. We've been what? Let's see here. 1970 until the present. That's what, 54 years? That's not all of the sudden. If this happens on a diocesan level, because I don't see Pope Francis in any way restricting the institutes. In fact, I've been validated on that as of yesterday with his meeting with the Institute of Christ the King. But if for some reason he does further restrictions or he just entirely discontinues it on a diocesan level, it's not all of the sudden entirely forbidden, because it isn't all of a sudden. So again, this quote has literally nothing to do with what we're talking about. And he says, or even, it can't even be considered harmful. The liturgy is not harmful. It's people who are weaponizing it. Liturgy is fine. Liturgy made saints. The Latin Mass, erroneously called, made saints. There's nothing wrong with it. By the way, the Novus Ordo has also made saints. So it's not considered harmful. It shouldn't be considered harmful. And I'll certainly fight against any Novus Ordo priest who would say otherwise. And I don't know any that would. I'm just saying if there is one, I'd fight against that and say that's also heresy. It behooves all of us to preserve the riches which have developed in the church's faith and prayer. Okay, yeah, and I agree, but frankly, I don't know if this is really being done consistently, because there's all kinds of liturgical rites that are no longer extant and haven't been preserved. The rites of venerable antiquity form a sacred and constitutive, they're no longer quoting Benedict, I believe. The rites of venerable antiquity form a sacred and constitutive part of the common patrimony of the church, and not even the highest ecclesiastical authority has power to prescribe them. We've literally seen the exact opposite from Trent, Vatican I, and it has an anathema against this heresy. So what they're teaching is heretical, and their teaching has been anathematized. And this is only scratching the surface with the problems of this fake catechism credo. Is any act of disobedience to a command of the Pope by itself schismatic? No. And with that, I would say I agree. So if the Pope is telling you to do something sinful, you don't have to obey that, of course. I don't know anybody who has ever said, yeah, you got to obey, even if the Pope tells you to murder somebody, you got to murder somebody. I don't know anybody who says otherwise. What we're talking about is modifying disciplines and liturgical aspects that don't pertain to sacred tradition. That's what we're talking about. And the elements of the Roman Rite that would be potentially discontinued between the Missal of 62 and 69 are not of sacred tradition. They don't originate from Jesus and the apostles. So there's something that comes much later, post-apostolic, and thus they are within the authority of the magisterium to modify or entirely discontinue. What the church binds, it can also loose. They're undercutting their own credibility of the very liturgy that they're trying to espouse. So the liturgy they're trying to espouse restricts reception of communion of the laity to just one kind. And there were reasons why that historically happened with the Roman Rite. But Protestants were coming along and saying, wait, hold on, you can't do that because the apostles administered communion under both kinds, not one kind. And okay, it's true that they administered under both kind, not one kind. But the Roman Church argued, but the church has authority over these matters, even though this liturgical discipline is apostolic. It's not sacred tradition. It's not of divine revelation. So they would make that distinction. So the very distinction that I'm pointing out here in this whole discussion is something that they would actually have to deny, but then it undermines the very liturgy that they're trying to promote. Because the very Roman Rite, as it's expressed in the Missal of 62 or 55 or whichever edition, it has some elements that does depart from apostolic liturgical disciplines. That's a fact. There's no way around that. Again, I think that the church had the authority to do that. So I'm going to go to bat for the Roman Rite and say that it had the authority to restrict communion under one kind. It had that authority. But they're implicitly going to have to deny that because they're denying it here. It says, one is not schismatic if he resists a pope or refuses to obey a particular teaching or command of his that is manifestly contrary to divine law, or that would harm or undermine the integrity of the Catholic faith or the sacredness of the liturgy. I'll just point out they're ignoring this whole aspect of magisterial teachings, even when they're non-definitive in nature, still having a charism of safety to them. They're ignoring all of that, bypassing it and negating it, which is not traditional at all. They're ignoring that traditional aspect of magisterial authority, throwing it under the bus, not even addressing it, asserting to the contrary. And then I would say, but discontinuing the Missal of 62 wouldn't fall under this anyway, because it's not going against the teaching that is somehow irreformable in nature. It's not going against the divine command. It's not going against natural or divine law. And it's not something that harms the integrity of the Catholic faith, because these are elements that didn't even exist in some centuries. Or the sacredness of the liturgy doesn't impact that either, because the elements didn't even exist for centuries in some cases, millennia, or a millennium in some cases. But I wouldn't say that the Roman liturgy prior to the introduction of some of those elements wasn't sacred or something because they're not present. So this has nothing to do with any of this. So the straw man that they presented doesn't even apply to the discussion. This is how lowbrow this stuff is. In such cases, disobedience and resistance to the Pope, good old Martin Luther language, is permissible and sometimes obligatory. Again, the only time you can disobey and resist the Pope is if he tells you to do something contrary to divine law. And he's not. Ergo, this is irrelevant. Ergo, these dissenters, according to their own definition of schism, are schismatic. Now, they're not even using the appropriate definition of schism, because schism is submission, a lack of submission to the Roman pontiff. So there's a deficiency in their definition. But according to their own definition of what schismatic is, since this isn't the case, the Pope's not violating any of these things, according to their own definitions, they're schismatic. It's a little weird. For decades, Catholic and non-Catholics alike have been confused by a strange and imposed sense of forbidding made to surround the traditional Roman Rite. Yeah, because these guys go around promoting a lot of propaganda and hatred and slander against the Holy Father. Instead of actually reading what he said, and what he said is it's not an issue of the liturgy itself. There is, however, concern of people who are weaponizing it. Who? Well, Schneider's a perfect example, among others. So a lot of people in this group, I've covered some names specifically on this channel, specifically and explicitly say, unless you have a Latin Mass available, don't go to liturgy. And I'm not just talking about the SSPX. Some of the non-SSPXers say that too. They say you can't go to a Novus Ordo. Some of them will say the Novus Ordo is intrinsically evil, intrinsically sinful, intrinsically impious. If there's no Latin Mass, I won't even go. This is, for instance, Kwasniewski says this. Now, again, the SSPX also says these wild things too, but even your non-SSPXers, some others who often do apologetics for the Missal of 62, they will say some of these things. Not only that, they will explicitly promote illicit ordinations in some of these communities over and against the authority of the local bishop and the Roman pontiff. And they'll engage in illicit ordinations and support illicit ordinations. And they'll say, we're also going to have clandestine liturgies over and against the local ordinary, setting up rival altars, as Ignatius of Antioch in the 2nd century puts it, which is, again, something he says is gravely immoral, it's schismatic. They will quite literally set up rival altars. Now they'll say, but we say the local ordinary's name in the liturgy. It doesn't matter when you're going against them. It doesn't matter what you say, it's what you do. And in fact, there are old Catholics, here I'm talking about those who deny Vatican I. There are some old Catholics who say the name of Pope Francis in the liturgy. That doesn't mean anything because they literally deny papal infallibility and Pope Francis's authority in many, many essential ways. So it doesn't matter if you say the name, you're doing this clandestinely over and against the very person whose name you're saying, and over and against their very authority. The same rite once universally treasured as most holy. Stop. The magisterium is clear. All of the rites and liturgies of the church are equally venerable. To try to say somehow the Roman Rite is most holy and most praiseworthy over and against the Eastern Rite, the Byzantine Rite, seriously? You really wanted to go there? I'm trying to defend you guys in some of these debates over and against some in the East who decry some of the innovations in the Roman Rite, and y'all just make it harder for me whenever you say wild, nonsensical things like this. This is absurd. Most worthy of devotion. So again, all of y'all who have some other liturgical rite, yeah, it's not as holy, not as praiseworthy, not as worthy of devotion. This is slanderous and incredibly impious, because it's the same Lord Jesus Christ who offers the same amount of grace and is in the same Eucharist in these other liturgies. Ridiculous. And again, as much as I love the Roman Rite, if we're going to say one rite is aesthetically better than another, I mean, there's going to be a lot of opinions here. Not everybody's going to agree with this particular point, but I don't even have that debate because I just say what the church says. Equally venerable. I've never heard of this guy, Aaron Singh. He's the writer here. Never heard of him. Okay. Thankfully, if a Catholic should ever need to defend his sacred heritage from misguided attempts to suppress it in the future, he now has a reliable Catholic catechism to reference for support. Is this the best y'all have? I've been waiting on y'all for years to address the magisterium on this, and y'all come up with this garbage? It's pathetic. It's a joke. This is the best stuff y'all have? All you can do is come up with these dubious catechisms with very poor references that don't account for the context or for other more authentic and authoritative expressions of the magisterium? what is this? Why don't they have any guys who are well versed in the magisterium? They're supposed to be traditional, yet none of them know the basics of the magisterium or what it actually has said about this issue. It's a joke. And I've been patient, I've been waiting, but you know what? At this point, gloves are off. You guys are a joke. Come up with something better than this. It's a mockery of the Catholic faith. When non-Catholics look in and see this stuff going on, well-versed non-Catholics, they're going to be laughing at you guys. And they're going to say, how could they be so ignorant? How could they be so naive? And you know what? They're right when they say that. Everybody hit the like button. Hit the subscribe button. Share this with others who are going to be confused by the promotion of this heresy. Help them see the actual dogmas of the Catholic Church, what the Church actually says about this issue. Share with them not only this video, but also share with them the other video I just did the other day about should Pope Francis further restrict access to the Missal of 62. That video is called, Is Pope Francis Banning Latin Mass? Examining the Rumors. Share that video with them as well, because I address the pros and the cons about whether or not he should further restrict access in certain contexts to this particular expression of the Roman Rite. I give you the good, the bad, and the ugly. Again, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. And if you want to support what I'm doing here, if you've benefited from the channel, if you think that this is meaningful content and you want to see others benefit from it, please consider supporting me at patreon.com/reason and theology. This is how I provide for my family. So if you find this to be a meaningful way that I provide for my family and help others understand their faith better, please help me continue that mission. Patreon.com/reason and theology or reasonandtheology.locals.com. Hey friends, do you want others to discover why the Catholic Church is the church that Jesus established? And do you want to help people make sense of all the confusion in the Catholic Church today? Help contribute to this mission by supporting Reason and Theology at patreon.com/reason and theology. By doing so, you'll also get access to exclusive content for patrons only. Also, if you want to deepen your faith, there are free ebooks and even courses that you can sign up for by visiting reason.podia.com.